Because it is a little cold in here today, I am turning to words of a colleague, Greta Crosby, who observed years ago that we should not wish away winter. It is a season to itself, not simply the way to get to spring, the time when trees rest, gathering no light, and trace themselves against the dawns and sunsets, the time when a low, dark sky can snow, emblem of individuality with its myriad flakes, of liberality with generous snow, and combined power to clog our lives. Winter is a table set with ice and starlight, she says. Let us therefore praise winter, rich in beauty, challenge, and pregnant negativities. Your turn to sing, because you cannot be fully present in spirit without being present in voice as well. We share the words of Eleanor Fargian in her famous hymn, Morning Has Broken, which speaks of a spring that is still a few weeks off. I'd like you to join with me now as we share words from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose words we will read all month as our invocation and a reminder of the wisdom that continues to be so powerfully present and important. Science investigates, religion interprets. Science gives man knowledge, which is power. Religion gives man wisdom, which is control. Science deals mainly with facts. Religion deals with values. Science keeps religion from sinking into the valley of crippling irrationalism and paralyzing obscurantism. Religious. Sounds like good advice if we ever followed it, but let's keep that in mind. Welcome. This is Fountain Street Church, which officially turned 150 years old this week. Did you see the little video online? So we are now 150 years old. We don't look a day over 160, I believe. And I'll refer to it a little later, but it's important for us to realize that this is an accomplishment that we cannot claim, we can only observe. It is all our ancestors who brought us here. And our task is to set a table for descendants. If you noticed, Channel 13 ran a brief piece about us earlier in the week, and they included that stained glass window up there of Mr. Darwin, a famous scientist. So these words from Dr. Martin Luther King may have been only 50 years old, but that window and our commitment to the conversation and mutual relationship between science and religion is more like 100 years old. We should be grateful, and it is our task to keep going. And that's what liberal religion is, a place to free your mind, to grow your soul, and to change the world. If you're here for the first time, welcome. If you're here for the 10,000th time, amazing. But however long you've been here, you are part of this community right now, and this community right now needs each and every one of us to do that job. So welcome to Fountain Street Church, now 150 years old, and we're hoping to start another 150 this week. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. For the eyes of the sparrow, and I know it watches me. Why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows fall? Why should my heart be lonely and long for peace and love? When songs give praise to sighing, when hope within me frees, the eyes of the sparrow, and I know it watches me. The eyes of the sparrow, and I know it watches me. Why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows fall? Why should my heart be lonely and long for peace and home? When songs give praise to sighing, and hope within me frees, the eyes of the sparrow, and I know it watches me. The eyes of the sparrow, and I know it watches me. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. For the eyes of the sparrow, and I know it watches me. So my son and daughter-in-law gave me a great gift this Christmas, but I can't use it here. I want to, but I can't. They're heated gloves. And one of the things getting older has given me is a strong case of Raynaud's syndrome. If you have it, you know what it is, and you don't like it. It is not a health risk, it's not a danger, but it is a misery in cold weather. But I can tell you right now, and you must attribute this to me, I'm claiming the copyright, 3/4 of being cold is being old. Literally and figuratively. Readings are a time when I lift up passages, not my own, words of others that are wise or weird, that comfort and confront. As I'm walking through Paul's first letter to the people of Corinth this month, which is a very long piece and cannot get a complete analysis here, I'm picking out verses that have stuck with me, that make me wonder and wonder. In this case, from the 5th chapter. Do you not know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Clean out the old yeast so that you may be a new batch, as you really are unleavened. For our paschal lamb, Christ, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the festival not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Far later, in our own era, the writer Audre Lorde wrote a passage found in our hymn book that touches on a similar but tangential point. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing on the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone, for those who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, for those of us who were imprinted with fear like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk. For by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard, not welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. This is not my true religion, this church. It is simply not. Religion is what you do habitually and constantly for your well-being. This is part of my religion, but my true religion is the YMCA, which Monday through Friday I trudge hot and cold, 1.5 miles down, whirl around with various weights and pieces of equipment, telling myself that I am prolonging my life and making myself healthier thereby. It's a ritual. It might or might not work. I believe in it. It's what I do. But of course, I'm not the only devotee. There are others who do the same thing, all in our Sunday worst, if you want to call it. There are plenty of people I don't even recognize on the street because they're wearing too many clothes. But there is one wonderful soul, Diane. Diane came from the Netherlands. She's 95. She's on the stationary bike 3 days a week, and after her 3 miles on the stationary bike goes down to swim, and now I know why she's 95. And we say hello, we visit. She's always very cheerful. And then in December, she hands me a package, and in it is a scarf. She clearly knits. I'm sure I'm not the only one. But I love it. It fits really well. But I want you also to see I'm wearing a gift too, this rather garish necktie. You would only, I'm glad you approve. I would never choose it myself, but that's the point of a gift. It's something you would not choose. And this was given to me by the church, actually, up on the 30th anniversary of my being in ordained life. And so I decided I'd wear two gifts today, in part to tell you that your offering can be to somewhat what Diane's offering was to me, a gift unanticipated, and something that on a colder day is very welcome indeed. So I'm going to ask you, how much can you give today to warm someone you don't know for an afternoon? If you can't knit, you can do what knitting does. And if you don't have that in you, a garish necktie or its equivalent price would be more than welcome. Your offering to warm, to wonder, will now be most gratefully received. Gee, that one reminds me of a great old Methodist hymn that I had to sing whenever I visited my mother-in-law. What is that? Standing on the Promises of God. Who knows that one? Oh, that's a fun one, isn't it? Boy, that was Wesley's. Thank you. And it has one of those choruses where the men and the women go back and forth. It's very rousing. I watch you sing from time to time. I watch you not sing as well. Let me put it that way. And what has this to do with prayer? Well, prayer and song are the same thing. They really are. They're an honest expression of who you are at a given moment. And you're going to say, well, when I'm not singing, I'm praying. And I'm thinking, no, you're not. There's a wonderful old joke about the theology professor and his students, and the two students are trying to confound him. So one of the students say, Professor, is it permitted to smoke while praying? And the professor thinks, well, of course not. Second student says, but sir, is it permitted to pray while smoking? Of course. My point here is that there are any activity that's done with integrity, with your full presence, is a prayer. And anytime you're absent from an activity absently, when you're just kind of phoning it in, that's not a prayer. It's putting yourself all in, as they say. So what would you do that puts you all in? Thanks to Ruth Stein, I go and join the annual community choir for Martin Luther King Sunday, which will perform on Sunday the 20th at New Hope Baptist Church. Then there will be a celebration the next night here. We're part of that. I don't think the community choir is taking part this year. Excuse me? The youth choir, but it doesn't matter. I get to go and join the choir for 2 weeks. Couldn't make yesterday's rehearsal, sadly, but I'm going to try to be there. And I'm all in when I do that. I'm not sitting there thinking, well, I don't agree with these words, because I don't. But I agree with their feeling, with their desire to be fully present spiritually in the world. And so I can do the translation thing and say, these folks here are expressing their deepest selves, so I better bring my deepest self to this song. And it's fun. It's a lot of fun. And choir, by the way, they do some really tough music, and they learn it all by ear. So you might want to join Ruth if you haven't joined her already. It's a new way to be choir. Okay? Prayer. Prayer is when you sing and no one but you can hear you. How about that? So I'm going to ask you, what lyrics do you sing when no one else is listening? I've asked this question before, whether it's the earworm. What is it that lifts your heart inside you? Or if no one was around, you would actually say out loud? I don't know. But we practice here. Collect our hearts. We let them open up a little more. We make a point of listening to the words, the sounds, the song that gives us the energy to go from here to there. With that in mind, we pray. Ancient, blessed, holy, mysterious, present, and absent, named and nameless. The more that is and surrounds what is. I need courage more than anything else. Sure, I could benefit by a little good luck. Wouldn't mind if I didn't have to climb every hill. And truly, dodging a few bullets would be wonderful, but more than anything else, I need courage. Courage to open my mouth when decorum says to be quiet. The courage to be present when anxiety makes me want to be absent. The courage to continue knowing I will fail in a good endeavor, rather than washing my hands and hoping for a better opportunity. Because the opportunity to be is only now. Only at this moment can I be who I am, and if I fail to be that, it is a failure of nerve, no matter how it turns out. So, as another of our souls of long ago said, grant us wisdom and grant us courage. But mostly courage. We can learn wisdom as we go, but courage is where it all begins. Upon this we pray.
Speak
each week, I ask that you pause and give honor to those whose lives came to their conclusion in this world at this time in this year and in years past. It's quite a list today. January seems to be a time a lot of people decide to finish their passage. I lift up the names of Barbara Amberg, Jean Kruger, Sally Hillman, George Meyer, Margaret Nickel, Paul Brown, Fred Garbrecht, George Ruwich, June Nordstrom, Stuart Hoffius, Naomi Brackney, Duncan Littlefair, Irmgard Greatchaus, Lynn Wallerman, Ruth Ruwich, Elizabeth Rosenbaum, George Branston, and Cherry Rose. El Malay Rachamim, Shokim Barachamim, God, filled with mercy, dwelling in the heavens heights, bring proper rest beneath the wings of your Shekinah to the souls of our beloved who have gone to their eternal place of rest. May you, who are our source of mercy, shelter them beneath your wings eternally and bind their souls to you and to we the living, that they may rest at peace, that we may be at peace, and let us say, Amen. So at the tender age of 8, my parents sometimes left me in charge of my younger siblings. I'm sure I was not unique, but it was not a task for which I had much preparation. Now behave while we're gone, my parents would say, chiding my brother and sister to mind me in their absence. But within minutes, my younger brother would ignore both them and me. And sure enough, when they came home, the first thing he would say was, I didn't do it. When they found some mishap or mess, he did do it, of course. That's what little brothers do. But he was very convincing in saying he wasn't. And of course, I wasn't going to say I did it. And of course, as so many parents do, say, well, since no one will admit it was their fault, we'll have to punish you both. Anyone ever go through that? Did you ever figure out that it really worked best for the miscreant who gets to avoid responsibility and inflict more pain on someone else? It's a lousy parental strategy, let me let you know. I thought about that as I'm reading the letter that Paul is writing to Corinth, because they're misbehaving in Corinth. They're way out of bounds. Paul has gotten letters about it. Last week, in the passage I read, one came from a woman named Chloe, and she was reporting then, maybe she was tattling, I don't know, on folks who were forming spiritual cliques, little clubs of people who were more spiritual than other people in the church, sort of like eating at tables where only cool Christians could eat. If that sounds a little snide, my point in exploring Paul is in part to restore the simple human drama that has been varnished over with piety and reverence. These were real people having real problems, and Paul was a real person, not a myth, who had real problems dealing with these folks. 1 Corinthians is a case study in bad church behavior, and I have served bad churches, or at least ones that misbehaved, and I've often dealt with what we in the clergy business call difficult people. In fact, there is a whole book devoted to that. We've all read it, and the title is Never Call Them Jerks. It doesn't mean we don't think about it. It just means you don't call them. Oh, let's put it this way. I can sympathize with Paul's point of view. People act out all the time. And writing from afar, his frustration and impatience are almost palpable. In addition to the spiritual cliques, there are lots of mice playing while the cat's away. He writes, it is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you. The real word is porneia, filth. And of a kind that is not found even among pagans, he goes on. For a man is living with his father's wife. He fulminates for some sentences, concluding, drive out the wicked person from among you. And that's when he talks about the yeasty things. You know how a bad apple can spoil the whole barrel, that kind of thing. Fearing, of course, that if you tolerate one, you'll tolerate 2 and 3 and 4, and before you know it, everything has gone bad. But in fact, this unnamed man is only one system of something more, which is why Paul continues and writes far more than that. The Corinthian Christians think that because they have been saved, they are no longer bound to earthly laws. The result is that some people are behaving well, like my little brother. They don't have to be good because no one's really watching. In fact, they are claiming that they don't have to follow the law at all. Paul quotes their own words when he says, "All things are lawful to me," but then he adds, Paul does, "but not all things are beneficial." In other words, you are free in ways you've never been free before, but that doesn't mean you can do anything just because you want to. You are using your freedom unwisely, for a bad end, for selfish ends. And we know how that happens. Some years ago in a previous church, a new family came to me. They were new to the church, but very close to a powerful family that had been recruited by them. And they came to see me soon after they joined to ask a favor. Would I provide a letter to the local Board of Education explaining that they had not vaccinated their children out of religious convictions? It was clear to me, after a long conversation, that they felt quite strongly, but quite wrongly. Like other families, they feared a reaction that would harm their children, a reaction now widely discredited. They feared it so much that they were willing to not vaccinate their children and depend upon the vaccinations of others. I was uneasy with the entire conversation, but in the end, I did give them the letter, and I have regretted it ever since. I did it to avoid their anger with me and, of course, of their powerful friends. Have you ever been in a position where you compromised your values? Well, I did. It was a moral failure on my part. But part of my problem was that I had no official creed or position I could back up to. Paul, at least, is saying, Jesus doesn't like this. The Bible doesn't like this. He's being firm, but he has a little backup. I didn't even have that. And liberal churches have this struggle because by allowing people to believe what they want, which is a fine thing, we also have very few standards to say those are out of bounds. We're left to our own devices. We can get into a kind of spiritual libertarianism that's not very far from those folks in Corinth who are saying, well, if I can believe what I want, I can pretty much do what I want. And I'm here to tell you, after many years of regretting that letter, that is not true. Here at Fountain Street Church, you may believe whatever you want, but you cannot do whatever you want. And even if you do believe certain things and express them, I'm going to guarantee that I'm not going to like them. Human sacrifice, for example. That's flippant, but let's be straightforward. Not all beliefs are okay, even at Fountain Street Church. There are limits. Ideas that support racism and sexism and intolerance. Ideas that deny the reality of facts, scientific in other words. Ideas that promote division and hatred and superiority. These are not okay at Fountain Street Church. Now, you can go ahead and believe them, but you cannot expect me to affirm them from this pulpit or even to you, or any of the actions that go with them. More than one person over the years has observed that just because you have a right to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And Paul is making that point 2,000 years ago, and I think we would do well to contemplate it ourselves. Now, I have to say I don't go along with Paul 100%. In fact, I'm going to disagree with him right now, because what he finds unacceptable is no longer the same list now as it was then. He goes on, after naming this notorious man, and lists fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, homosexuals, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, and robbers. None of these will inherit the kingdom of God. And it makes some sense to Paul in his time. He was a Jew, and his view of Christ was that Christ was there to welcome everyone to follow the same moral code that he did. In this coming kingdom, everyone would be upright and holy and pure. And these were people who would never be upright, holy, and pure no matter what. But as I just mentioned, what was unholy and impure in his day is not the same now. Now, modern conservatives lament this all the time. We need to get back to the good old days. And I want to say, which good old days were those? I don't remember them as being that good. People who see the past as being better than the present. But my favorite philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, famously observed that great ideas often enter reality with evil associates and disgusting alliances. Did you hear what he just said? The first iteration of a great idea is not its best iteration. Paul's great idea, which was great, is that Christ came to restore the world to the state God intended, united across ethnicities and classes, undivided by nation or religion. But it retained at that moment the evil associate and disgusting alliance of purity, a concept almost universal in ancient times and still present in a lot of religions. And I want to focus my attention for most of the rest of this sermon on this disgusting and evil notion of purity. Walking through Japan some years ago, I paused at a variety of Shinto shrines where you are obliged to purify yourself. You pour water on each hand, you rinse out your mouth, and then you can approach the shrine. When I was in India a couple of years after that, I watched people bathing in the Ganges, washing away the karma of their previous lives. Muslims around the world will wash their hands and feet before going in to pray. It's called wudu. And of course, Christian baptism, the word baptism itself means to wash, derives from the Jewish ritual of bathing in something called a mikvah, which is meant to clarify and purify you before taking part in various rituals. Purity is worldwide and almost as old as the human family. Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, in his work, The Righteous Mind, notices purity and its obverse disgust and observes and asks this question: why did so many ancient texts devote so much space to rules about menstruation, what we can eat, who can have sex with whom? There is no rational or health-related reason to explain all these laws. The emotion of disgust seems to me a more promising explanatory principle. That's disgusting. Have you often said that? Do you know why you were saying it? It literally means to vomit, by the way. It makes you sick. But what makes people sick now is not what made people sick years ago. Some things are the same. There's no question in my mind that simple hygiene is the origin of the notion of purity. I opened a quart of milk the other day, and it stank. I did not drink it. I poured it down the drain. It was disgusting. If you leave something in the refrigerator long enough, it will turn a color and evince an aroma that does not make it appetizing anymore. We have a good reason to throw away the things, part ourselves from things that are foul-smelling and foul-looking. But I think it extends beyond this, and this is where it gets tricky. It goes beyond simple personal health to social health, if you will, to define behaviors within communities and relations between communities. You may recall a recent film that was called Loving, about the family, but also about the act thereof of loving, that detailed the struggles of a black woman and a white man in 1960 who were convicted of miscegenation. That's the fancy word for black people marrying white people. And that was a law in a number of states, and it was thankfully overturned by the Supreme Court, but it had been legitimate for over 100 years in most of the nation. Now, that wasn't just for the abstract principle as racism. Many people thought that the notion of racial mixing was disgusting. And I know this because as late as the 1970s, soon after I was married, my very Southern mother-in-law, having met my classmates, Mark, who was black, and his wife, Donna, who was white, confided to my wife and to me when they weren't looking that seeing them made her sick. Now, we're disgusted at her disgust, but I want you to take her disgust seriously for just a moment. Not that she's right, but that she actually had the feeling. Because she was not lying. Because we had some people telling us just a few years ago and today that the thought of two men or two women being intimate is disgusting. And they still feel that way. Purity can outgrow its purpose of preserving personal health into defining entire social contexts. It ultimately is about clarity, knowing who is who and what's what, knowing where everything should be. If, as Robert Frost wrote, good fences make good neighbors, purity is the fence-making process. You go here and I go there, you stay here and I'll stay there. If unknown food and drink can poison you, then unknown and odd people can poison your community. Paul's list was very typical in its day of unwelcome behaviors, but here's where it gets really revolutionary. He is at the same time saying it doesn't matter if you're male or female, Greek or Jew, Roman or not. As long as you don't do these things, you're still welcome. And that was revolutionary because in most nations, you couldn't go from one nation to another. You would always be a foreigner if you left your land. You would always be inferior if you came from another country. So he took a daring step. That humanity, by nature, belongs together. It's just these behaviors that will exile you. Sadly, Christianity, as it became more organized, succumbed to the pressures of purification. It not only exiled certain behaviors, but also certain beliefs, and it used its power to divide itself just like the Corinthians did. The urge to purify seems ever to be present. I'll come back to its current iteration in just a moment. To make this pertinent to us now, though, and informative, Jonathan Haidt further observed that a key distinction between modern liberals, most of us in this room would raise our hand to that, and modern conservatives is that liberals deny or devalue the importance of purity and the importance of disgust, while conservatives hang on to it. And you're about to say, well, we're more informed than they are. I don't think so. Because the tough part, friends, is that the moment we say we're better than they are, we're committing the act of purification ourselves, aren't we? Liberals are offended and disgusted as well, just by different things. Knowing what deserves our disgust, everyone's disgust, is the challenge. You may remember a fable I told from Charles Lamb, a writer in 18th century England. He contrived a story about how people were vegetarian until a barn burned down and they smelled the flesh of the pigs and decided it was good to eat. And thereafter, barns caught on fire very regularly. I heard your laughter and I knew you would laugh. Because we know we don't have to burn down a barn to cook meat. The problem with traditional ancient purity is that it burns a barn to accomplish what a spit could do. The sense of disgust and the desire for purity are not irrational or unwelcome. They are just overdone and excessive. But they have a root, a keen and real desire, safety, to feel safe and secure.
In ancient times, one's race, meaning ethnicity, one's gender, and other taboos were the only way you could be sure you were safe in your village or your nation. And you were suspicious of everyone else, and not irrationally. They were an axe compared to the modern scalpel of public sanitation and the rule of law. But someday I hope that even those will become crude tools compared to other ways we have to make distinctions. Much as amputation gave way to antiseptics, someday I hope that national borders will be irrelevant and our humanity will be celebrated rather than feared. And that is why I can now say I reject and find repellent the president's call for a border wall, because it is brutal and costly and wasteful. It is burning down the barn. Dana Milbank, a columnist for Washington Post, a very humorous columnist in this column in this place, said it was not evil so much as it was medieval. He is literally right. Walls are what medieval societies build to protect themselves, walls and fortresses, and they were effective for a very long time until someone invented gunpowder, and then they just became large piles of rocks that enclosed people that you could slaughter. They do not work as well today as they did now. But more important, to me at least, is that the president is appealing to the brutal notion of purity and safety, to evoke race and gender and religion as means to consolidate peoples who are afraid and give himself authority by promising to protect them. People care about purity when they fear for their safety. And when afraid, people will do brutal things like building walls or burning barns. Except that in the case of nations, when they burn barns, they're full of people, black people, immigrants, Jews, Muslims, gays, whoever is too different to feel safe around. If we want to stop this, arguing with them will not help. That's only part of the proof that they are right and you are wrong. Part of the place, perhaps the first place to start, is with the legitimacy of their fear, if not the legitimacy of the cause of that fear. As a pastoral counselor, the first thing I say when someone comes in pain is not to say, "Oh, stop feeling bad, grow up." No, you say, "Tell me about your pain. Describe your sorrow. Listen to what it is before you tell them how to change it." The place to start is with hearing the fear. Not their fear. In fact, I want to hear about yours, ours. And as one of the few rules of leadership that I have ever kept consistently over the years, leaders show and lead by example. So I should tell you about my fears, the things that worry me, what makes me feel unsafe and insecure. I had chest pains 2 weeks ago. I am 65. This is no longer trivial. It used to be, when you were young, almost any pain could be shrugged off, just ignored, but no more. The thought of illness and disability is frightening. When I was a very young minister in my 20s, there was a group of seniors brought together to talk about what's important to them. They ranged in age from 65 up, and they talked about a variety of things, but the oldest man in the room, a retired professor, when asked what he feared the most, he had one word: falling. I did not understand. Today I understand. Illness and disability are more than an intimation of death. They are the loss of agency, of dignity, of humanity. I am afraid not only for it now, but for it later. As I contemplate retirement from here, I'm going to add another fear: poverty. Now, not because it is likely. I have been fortunate to set some money aside, but because it is uncertain. I have no idea what the economy of the future holds. I have no idea whether it will be sufficient. And while I know that my children will care for me, I do not wish them to. More abstract than these two is my fear of uselessness, of no longer having a role to play. It has been a great gift to be in a profession that allows me to feel like I'm contributing to the good of the world, if not of the world, then of a community. And once you stop being that, then who are you? And how can I be useful in a way that is more than cleaning the house and puttering in the kitchen or the yard? I need to feel like I have value. And then I think, if I feel those things and more, and I am not sick or poor or useless now, what about those who already are? If fear is what drives us to build medieval walls and to burn the barn of reason, to purify ourselves of aliens and deviants and other social infections, paradoxically, fear is the thing that can break through the walls as well when we talk about it and confess to it. If we are afraid of our society falling apart, and I guarantee liberals and conservatives have that fear, both. Let's consider the mothers and fathers in Honduras who are willing to walk for 1,500 miles to try and gain entry to a country that they know already doesn't want them. How afraid are they? And how about those in Syria who have been trying to get into Europe and have been met with the Viktor Orbáns of the world? And those who cannot even leave Yemen. When I consider my fear, I cannot help but feel that others have more fear than me, and who am I to keep out those who have even greater reason to fear than I? You may remember years ago I read from one of the many books in my Bible penned by Dr. Seuss, a story called The Pale Green Pants with Nobody Inside Them. You know the story? If you don't, go home and read it. It's a very short book in that Bible and very instructive. Young person says going out to pick a peck of snide and ran into a pair of pale green pants with nobody inside. Horrifying, scary, terrifying, fled. And it turned out that the pants were just as afraid of the author as, you know what I'm saying. And the last picture was of the author draping a comforting arm around the pale green pants with nobody inside, because they had shared the reality that both of them were essentially the same in their fear. Not the same creature, but the same spirit. You know, if you've been around the church Monday through Friday, you know that Alcoholics Anonymous meets here. They have been probably more faithful to their religion than we are to ours. And that's because they share the hard things. They share the fear. They invite you to be frightened in public. I think we are desperately in need of leaders and institutions that are not afraid of being afraid, that have the courage not to hide their fear or overcome it, but to be afraid in the presence of others. It's hard because when you say, I'm frightened, it makes you look more weak and helpless than you already feel. But courage, as we all know, is not fearlessness, it's acting while afraid. Do we know what we fear as a church? I think this is something that we should contemplate. Not because it's going to happen, but because it propels some of the actions we all take. Do we have the courage to to talk about what we fear in our lives, in our church, in our community, without blaming it on this or that, without trying to fix it now or explain it all. Just be afraid together, the way Audre Lorde invited us to remember our fear. That may be the hardest thing any of us as people or as institutions can do, to say we are frightened, we are insecure. But we all know that the hardest thing in the end is almost always the most powerful thing we have available to do. Paul saw this, which is why I like him. I don't agree with him often, but I do like him as a person. He's a real person. Later on in the letter, or in another place, he writes, "For I think God has exhibited us apostles as least of all, as those sentenced to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels and to mortals. We are fools for the sake of Christ, so that you may be wise. We are weak, so that you may be strong. You are held in honor, but we are in disrepute." What I hear him saying as he perceives the power within being powerless in public, the strength within weakness, if one is courageous enough to own the weakness, the courage, the very deep courage that resides in being willing to be afraid in front of others. And this from a man whose output would not make a chapter in a decent book, and yet changed the entire world. There is the power of living with your fear. Do we wish truly to change the world? Maybe we should find that courage ourselves. We will find more than courage if we do. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my Redeemer. We're going to change the mood instantaneously. Having observed 150 years of life in this church, let us now imagine 150 years ahead. No one here will be here, but perhaps the church will. And that's what we will sing about with our closing hymn, number 144, "Now is the Time Approaching." Shall we join together in words of hope and joy? Where hate rules, let us bring love, said St. Francis. Where sorrow, joy, let us strive more to comfort than to be comforted, to understand than to be understood, to love more than to be loved. For it is in giving we receive, and in pardoning we are pardoned, knowing that this day and every day is the day which the Lord has made. Let us rejoice ever and be glad in it. May it be.